the way that Hamas rigged the Gaza Strip, spent 16 years preparing the entire landscape by booby-trapping buildings, putting the tunnel entrances inside homes, the weapons under children's beds, was deliberately designed to put Israel in this lose-lose situation, knowing that mugs around the West are going to effectively allow Hamas to gain immunity for itself by deliberately weaponizing international law. I do think they are big international law guys, because they know that the unwritten rule of international law for some people is that there's nothing Israel does will ever be right.
That's right, yeah.
But why is there that failure around the West to understand the terms of engagement? That Israel is fighting against, Israel, imperfect, flawed, blah, 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 whatever, is fighting against a death cult that is deliberately setting on fire every rule, every norm, every law that the world has held dear, and simply setting fire to that architecture of international law, of law and order.
I tell you what, I think there's a primary cause which we should be clear about calling out, which I mentioned, which is, I think for a lot of the world outside of Israel, a lot of the world thinks that Israel did something wrong from the start. And whatever the Palestinians, the Arabs do, somewhere deep down, in the 1940s, before, since, there is some good reason for Arab discontent with Israel. I think we have to see a lot of people.
It's not a pathology; it's a grievance.
Yes, they think, well, you know, something was done wrong at the root, and I think that perception is wildly more prominent and acceptable than a lot of people want to realize.
Spelling it out, that Israel's creation was
a mistake.
An original sin.
An original sin, absolutely. An original sin. And
some ideas have very long lineage.
Don't they just? Don't they just? And, you know, it was interesting, actually, when I was debating in Toronto with our friend Natasha Hausdorff last year against our mutual enemy, Mehdi Hassan, Natasha used a really brilliant analogy I hadn't heard anyone use before. She said, you know, when a couple of, I don't know, conceived, you know, a woman's conceived a baby, and she and her husband may have a discussion about whether or not to terminate that pregnancy. And of course, there's all sorts of moral issues in that. But we recognize that may be a discussion that a couple may have, a woman may have. But if the child is brought, if the baby is brought to term, is born, let alone is in their 70s, you're not discussing an abortion, you're discussing murder. And Israel is in her 70s, and if part of the world still thinks that this grown-up state should be aborted, then they are talking about murder, and mass murder at that. That is what they're backing. That is the side they're on. And some people do come out and say that, yeah, I think it should be scrapped. They never have
their honesty.
Yeah, I know. In a way, one admires their honesty. They never seem to have a very good plan for the orderly transportation of all the Jews. But doubtless they are thinking about that, I'm sure, in a humane manner. But a lot of people don't actually concede that's what they mean. And I find this very troubling. I think that people should concede this is one of the things that happens. To use an analogy I've used, you know, Pakistan was created as a nation within a year of the creation of the State of Israel, and Pakistan has been responsible for a lot more deaths in war from its founding than the State of Israel. But if you were to say, I think Pakistan has basically forsaken its right to existence, and it must be abolished. Then, I mean, you're like, okay, what's your plan for that? And how did you come to this decision? And so on. But you'd also be thought, by the way, to be a complete nutter, and probably be expected. People would say that you seemed to have an animus against the Pakistani people and the state of Pakistan, and you'd kind of have to say, yeah, because I'm looking around the world and lots of other people have done bad things, but this is a country I want to abolish.
This is what is so disturbing about the annihilationist rhetoric towards Israel, because people who will say Israel's borders were, artificially imposed by the West, by the same West that created the borders of modern Syria and Iraq, and everyone accepts that that's legitimate and no one is asking to revise those. And other countries were born out of horrific population transfers, like India and Pakistan, Greece and Turkey. But there is no one who is suggesting now that Greece and Turkey should reverse their population exchange, or that it should be done only unilaterally. And Israel remains, we talk about double standards, the only case where people around the West do feel quite comfortable saying there was this original sin that took place over 70 years ago and we must go back and rectify it. And I think part of, you could even call it messianic rhetoric, it's the belief that when you rectify that mistake, you're not only fixing Israel, somehow you're redeeming the world. You're redeeming the world, right? And that's part of the projection that we find, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. But I wanted to linger just on this question of the tunnels in the children's bedrooms. That's what's especially disturbing, because there is a perception sometimes that says Hamas are aliens who came from outer space. They are a small radical group who don't represent the Palestinians. And I wish that were true. The fact is that the way that Hamas rigged Gaza for war required a huge amount of civilian buy-in. No, I'm not saying everyone in Gaza supports Hamas. No, I'm not saying everyone is a jihadist. But you cannot build such a massive network of tunnels, diverting so many resources, putting those tunnels inside civilian facilities, hiding rockets in Boy Scout clubs and hospitals, without a massive degree of buy-in from a population that agrees with Hamas's ideology, the same ideology held by many in the West. The state of Israel is illegitimate. Violence in the pursuit of its destruction is not only morally permissible, it is somehow redemptive. There is nothing that we can do wrong. They are forcing us to do wrong. And that is what makes this conflict all the more disturbing for me when we deal with the question of evil and death cults. Because it's not just about removing a death cult from power. It's about a much wider social problem and needing to deal seriously with the question of the de-radicalization of Palestinian society. And I wonder, from what you've seen in Gaza, how wide you think that death cult problem is. Do you limit it to Hamas, or do you cast your net a little bit wider?
I think it has to be wider. I think it has to be. I mean, look, let's just take the testimony of Israeli hostages who've been returned home. It's extremely hard to find a hostage who's come back from Gaza who has a story of any Gazan being kind to them. The population of Gaza seems, by all evidence, indeed including video evidence, seems to have been overwhelmingly supportive of Hamas's would-be genocidal actions.
Right, there are Palestinian polls asking them whether they think the October 7th massacre was a good idea despite everything that had happened since. And it took over a year into the war for a majority of Gazans to come to the conclusion that it was probably a bad idea.
And even then, it's because of the what's happened to their society since.
Not because of some moral awakening.
Not because they've suddenly realized that you ought to.
Because it has quite literally blown up in their faces.
Yeah, and they so they sort of inevitable that they might end up having some second thoughts about some of that. But no, I mean, if you see the as you have, as many people watching have, if you see the video of hostages being taken into Gaza, the civilian population is overwhelmingly joyous that wounded Israeli girls are being brought to captivity. Hostages who managed, in some cases, to escape were returned by Gazan civilians. there seems to be, when the offer was made some months ago to the citizens of Gaza after the death of Sinwar, to come forward and bring out hostages, and if they did so, they'd get a large cash reward and safe passage. How many times was that offer taken up?
None.
Zero. None.
None of the people holding the hostages.
Nobody did it. Now, you might say, oh, there's endless would-be saints in Gaza who would like to do it. It's just that the situation was too dangerous. I don't think that is the only explanation at all. I think it's that overwhelmingly the civilian population of Gaza approves of the methods of Hamas and approves of the keeping of Israeli hostages.
Sure, although in that particular case, most of the hostages are being held by Hamas terrorists, and it's not up for civilians to decide whether to give them back, although we do know that some hostages were held in civilian homes. But I wonder specifically...
And moved between civilian homes and tunnels and so on. And
on the question of de-radicalization, the Prime Minister laid out at the beginning of the war in a Wall Street Journal column the 3 Ds that he said are the prerequisites for peace between Israel and Gaza. You have to destroy Hamas, you have to demilitarize Gaza, but you also have to de-radicalize Palestinian society. Now, you write in your book, there will, of course, be a commission of inquiry in Israel into how the disaster of October 7th happened. I'm not sure I agree with your of course or presumption that it will happen, because the Prime Minister is trying to block one, but there must be a commission of inquiry. The difference between us and them is we take responsibility and we learn from our mistakes. But I do wonder whether there also needs to be an international commission of inquiry. We had our own conception. We knew that Hamas was evil. We didn't want to believe how evil it was. We thought that, like many other despots, they could be bought off and deterred, and they wouldn't
corrupt.
attack us. Exactly, like many despots become corrupt. But Hamas could not have built the terrorist empire that it built in the Gaza Strip without billions of dollars of international aid that liberated it from responsibility for the civilian population, allowed it to invest in its tunnels because the UN was taking care of welfare and education. And we see where that education took us, because most of the October 7th monsters were in fact graduates of UN schools. But it means that Hamas was able to do what it did on October 7th because the international community subsidized its war machine. And I wonder whether you think there is any prospect of the international community doing some introspection and understanding how that strategy has taken foreign taxpayer money and invested in a death cult, because it is as stark as that.
I think it would be easier to get every Jew in the world to agree to something than it would be.
That's a no.
Than it would be to get the international community to take any responsibility for its role in all of this. If you speak to politicians from Western countries about, for instance, the funding of UNRWA, they will overwhelmingly say to you, first of all, they'll deny what UNRWA did. They'll deny what various UN forces and organizations have done and their culpability in all of this. But then they will say, you know, what else can we do? This is the mechanism through which we fund education in Gaza. You know, what are the other options? And, you know, you would have thought, well, before you throw American taxpayer money or British taxpayer money into a money pot that is used to teach Gazans to kill the Jews, you ought to just try not to fund that before anything else. But their thing is always, they always say, you know, what's the other mechanism we can use to fund these poor Palestinians in Gaza? And I don't see any likelihood of that changing.
Right, there is no, you know, I often get asked as well, what is the alternative to UNRWA? And the question is, maybe Palestinian responsibility.
Yeah.
Maybe instead of assuming that the UN has to teach them forever, you understand that they have a government, the Hamas government of Gaza, perfectly capable of levying taxes on goods, raising money, but it used that money in order to build tunnels instead of investing in education, because you took raising the next generation of jihadists off its hands. So perhaps the answer isn't that the world should throw more money at it. The answer is that Palestinians should take some responsibility for themselves. And in that question of responsibility, Douglas, the death cult is not just Hamas. Hamas. Obviously, it's not everyone. I'm not going to generalize down to the last percentile. But there is a deep-seated problem of a jihadi ideology that has been subsidized and kept alive artificially by dumb Western taxpayers. And I wonder, do you see any prospect? I mean, are we being naive to think that de-radicalization is possible?
I think it is pretty naive, yes. Certainly in the current structure. And there's two things I'd say. Firstly, there has been a misunderstanding for many years. It's existed all my adult life, which is that if the Palestinians are given another state, and I stress that, it's not they haven't got a state, they get another state. Well, I mean, they've basically got a state in the West Bank. I mean, they've got Palestinian Authority, they've got their own pseudo-ministries and things. It's basically a state. I spent plenty of time then. It's a state in all but name. You've got Jordan.
Although, in name, it calls itself a state.
Yeah, it calls itself a state, exactly. I mean, not recognized by everyone as such, but it regards itself as such. The Palestinian
Not
Authority.
Independent, not contiguous, but the trappings thereof.
Jordan is effectively a Palestinian state.
Gaza was a Palestinian state.
And crucially, Gaza was a Palestinian state. They were given the Gaza in 2005, and the fruits of that gift were seen in war after war since, and then on October the 7th. So the misunderstanding is, if another state is awarded to the Palestinians, amazingly, of all people in the world, they just need to keep on having states, despite doing nothing to earn them, and indeed turning them away when they're offered them. There's this misunderstanding that left and right, Republicans and Democrats, Labour and Conservatives, right and left across Europe have engaged in, which is this fundamental misunderstanding. Give the Palestinians another state, and all the problems of the region, and perhaps indeed of the world, will be solved. Why this should be so, no one can ever explain to me. But this is the belief. It is as a great...
Well, the belief is that the conflict is won over territory, and if you compromise by drawing a line down the middle and compromise, we both ultimately want the same thing. You're not dealing with a jihadi death cult, so we can compromise.
But you see, this was. I mean, every idiot from David Miliband to William Hague in the UK, from Labour to Conservative, always trotted out this thing, the solution to the problems in the Middle East is creation of a Palestinian state, never again acknowledging that plenty of states already for the Palestinians. Why it should be the case that another Palestinian state would unlock, to use the term they always use, unlock all of the problems of the region, nobody can explain. You could have another Palestinian state ruled over by whichever corrupt or terrorist entity you wanted, and, there'd still be problems in Yemen. The Iranian revolutionary government would not suddenly become a sort of progressive, tolerant, peaceful regime just because another state had been given to the Palestinians. The economy of countries across the region that are impoverished would not boom. Egypt would be no better off. So that's the first misunderstanding. It's just this stupid idea that's demonstrably false, that the creation of another Palestinian state would solve every other problem in the Middle East and perhaps the wider world. To use the idiot sort of slogan that's been used quite widely in America. What is it? Things like injustice anywhere means injustice everywhere, or something like this. The sort of that if you unlock the problem of the Palestinian statehood question, you immediately get less COVID in Berkeley.
Right, this belief that almost all forms of oppression and all injustices are somehow cosmically linked to each other.
It is something that's an idiot idea from the American Academy of recent decades. Everything's interlinked. And so if you find, as it were, the worst injustice in the world, which is what they think that the Palestinian issue is, that if you solve that, then immediately everyone can get bottom surgery in California. Is basically, as far as one can discern any pattern in their beliefs, this is what they actually seem to think.
You don't think you're mischaracterizing them slightly?
No, I'm being infinitely generous in my analysis at the moment. But let me just get on to the second thing from that. So there's this misunderstanding about what another Palestinian state is. But then you come to the second thing which is that effectively there has been no plan from the international community until very recently that would solve what problem exists, which is the endless creation of death cults in among Israel's neighbors. And until Trump recently started talking about clearing civilians from Gaza, encouraging civilians to leave Gaza and move elsewhere whilst it's rebuilt, the only plan that anyone in the international community seemed to have was stop the war, spend billions of dollars and pounds and euros of foreign taxpayer money building up Gaza again, only for the Gazans to do the same thing in a couple of years' time.